The gravel crunched under my shoes as I stood frozen in my son's driveway, the late afternoon light cutting sharp lines across the hood of his car. My phone was still warm in my hand from the call that shattered every assumption I had about the woman who'd married into our family. Something in the air felt wrong, too still, too watchful, as if the world already knew what I was about to learn. If you've ever trusted someone who wasn't who they claimed to be, subscribe and tell me where you're listening from. You're not alone in that kind of heartbreak. I remember gripping the railing just to steady myself, the truth pressing against my ribs like it was trying to escape before I could. That was the moment everything started to unravel. I remember the way my hands trembled on the steering wheel as I pulled into my son's driveway in Cedar Grove, knowing I was carrying the kind of truth that could split a family wide open. Just an hour earlier, my attorney had told me something about my daughter-in-law that knocked the breath out of my chest. I kept replaying his words, trying to make them fit into the life I thought we had, but nothing made sense anymore. My name is Helen Wallace, and until that moment, I believed my son had finally found peace. I believed I had gained a daughter. I believed our fractured little world had stitched itself back together. But betrayal has a way of showing up without warning, turning certainty into dust. As I sat in that driveway, watching the warm light spill from their kitchen window, I felt fear crawl up my spine. I could sense that everything familiar was about to collapse, and somehow, I would be the one to start the avalanche. I didn't want any of this. I just wanted my family to be safe. But that night, I realized wanting isn't enough. Let me go back and tell you how everything unraveled. I remember how different life felt just a few months before everything fell apart. Back then, the world seemed warm again, almost gentle, as if it were finally giving me a little room to breathe after years of learning how to live without my husband. I had been a widow for so long that I almost forgot what it felt like to witness genuine joy in my own family. So when my son, Michael, told me he had met someone who made him light up in ways I hadn't seen since he was a boy, I let myself believe things were turning in our favor. Grace Porter stepped into our lives with a softness that made it easy to trust her. She had this way of making me feel included, valued, even needed. After years of quiet evenings in an old house that held more memories than conversations, her presence felt like sunlight through heavy curtains. When she suggested that selling my home might give all of us a fresh start, I convinced myself she was right. I used the sale to help them with their wedding, covering $3,000 of the $42,000 cost, telling myself it was a gift of love, not sacrifice. And when I moved closer to them, I truly believed I was stepping into a new chapter, one where family gatherings would be frequent, laughter would replace silence, and I would no longer feel like a guest in my own life. Everything looked perfect, almost suspiciously perfect, though I didn't recognize that feeling at the time. I only knew I wanted to believe in this new beginning, but perfection has sharp edges, and mine was already starting to lift at the corners, even if I didn't see it yet. And that brings me to the moment when the first crack finally showed. I still remember how quickly the peace of that season shattered. I had been folding laundry in my small apartment, feeling grateful for how smoothly life seemed to be settling, when my phone buzzed with a message from my attorney. It was brief, but the urgency in it felt completely out of place for a quiet afternoon. He never reached out unless something required immediate attention. And the moment I saw his words asking me to call him right away, a cold weight settled in my stomach. When I heard his voice, I knew before he said anything that something was terribly wrong. There was a tightness to it, a kind of careful pause that people use when they're about to deliver news they wish they didn't have to give. He told me he had run into unexpected inconsistencies while updating some documents connected to my finances, and those inconsistencies pointed directly to Grace. At first, I tried to push back against the thought. I kept hearing my own mind insist that there had to be a mistake, that the woman who had woven herself so gently into our family couldn't be hiding something this serious. But as he laid out the small discrepancies, details that should have been easy to verify but weren't, I felt flashes of moments I had brushed aside, times when Grace had avoided talking about her past, or when her stories shifted slightly, small enough for me to excuse but large enough to echo now in my mind. My instinct and my denial battled each other, but instinct won. By the time I hung up, my hands were shaking. I knew I couldn't sit still and pretend nothing was happening. I grabbed my keys, walked straight to my car, and started driving toward Michael's house without calling ahead. That was the moment everything truly began to unravel. I pulled into Michael's driveway with a heaviness I could feel in my chest, the kind that made every breath feel slightly thinner than it should have been. From the outside, everything looked peaceful. Warm kitchen lights glowed through the windows, and for a moment, I found myself wishing I could unlearn what I had just been told. I wanted this scene to mean what it used to mean: family, comfort, a life finally settling into place. But the truth was already sitting beside me like an unwelcome passenger, and I couldn't ignore it. As I walked toward the house, I noticed details I had somehow overlooked for months. Every corner of the space reflected Grace's taste: sleek lines, pale colors, curated decor that seemed almost staged. Nothing of Michael lived there. None of his old photographs. None of the small pieces from his childhood home that he used to treasure. The more I looked, the more it felt like he had been gently erased. And then I saw him, my son. He smiled, but it reached nowhere near his eyes. There was a tiredness in his face I had missed, a quiet strain beneath his greeting that made my heart tighten. It struck me then how much I had wanted to believe everything was perfect, how willingly I had smoothed over the moments that hadn't quite fit. Inside, I sensed Grace watching us with a careful alertness, and for the first time, I couldn't tell whether it came from affection or calculation. When Michael suggested we step aside for a moment, I felt an undercurrent of relief in him, as if he'd been waiting for someone else to notice what he couldn't name. That was when I realized the truth wasn't just unraveling for me, it had already begun to unravel for him too. I didn't ease into it when Michael and I stepped into his office. There was no soft way to deliver what I had learned, no gentle path to the truth. I told him exactly what my attorney had uncovered, and as the words left my mouth, I watched the color drain from my son's face. It was as if each piece of information struck him twice, once as shock, and then again as recognition. I could see him recalling moments he had quietly filed away, moments he had dismissed because love can make denial feel like loyalty. He sank into his chair, and I felt a wave of guilt roll through me. I had welcomed Grace so fully into our lives that I never questioned the cracks in her stories. I let myself believe what felt comfortable. And now my son was sitting there, trying to make sense of a marriage that suddenly felt like a performance staged around him. We talked through the details, the little inconsistencies that had seemed harmless at the time, the sudden control she had taken over their finances, the way she always stepped out of the room to take certain calls, the missing pieces of her background that never quite fit together. Each memory added weight to the growing dread between us. When we finally walked back toward the kitchen, the air felt wrong. Too still, too careful. Grace was gone, though the back door sat slightly open as if she had slipped out without a sound. My heart started pounding, and Michael scanned the room with a kind of stunned disbelief. Then he noticed her phone on the table, unlocked. I picked it up, and the messages staring back at us confirmed the worst. Conversations about extracting money, about timing, about us. That was the moment we realized we had only uncovered the surface of who Grace really was. I thought I was prepared for whatever the investigators were about to show us, but the moment they opened that file, I felt the ground under me tilt. Photo after photo spilled out across the table. Different hairstyles, different clothes, different names, but the same eyes staring back at me. Grace Porter didn't exist. The woman I had welcomed into my family was Charlotte Benson, a seasoned con artist who had been weaving in and out of other people's lives for years. Each alias came with a trail of victims stretching across several states, and each story followed a pattern that felt sickeningly familiar. As the investigators explained her methods, I felt a cold heaviness settle over me. Charlotte studied people. She learned their soft spots, their grief, their hopes. She moved toward anyone standing alone, and somewhere along the way, she recognized Michael's tenderness and saw my vulnerability as an invitation. It struck me hard when they said her real focus was never the marriage. It was me. The warmth she showed, the affection, the trust she pretended to build. None of it was real. Every moment I had replayed with gratitude transformed into proof of how thoroughly she had planned to strip away my security. Rage rose in me, sharper than the heartbreak. She had mapped out our lives like steps in a scheme, and I had unknowingly played right into her hands. But beneath that anger was something steadier, a resolve I didn't know I still had. The investigators told us she would almost certainly try to return for the remaining money. That was her pattern, her unfinished business. And then they laid out the plan they wanted me to take part in, a plan designed to draw her out and finally stop her. That was the moment everything shifted toward the sting operation waiting ahead. I barely slept the night before the sting, even knowing investigators would be nearby. A tightness settled in my chest that wouldn't let go. I kept repeating to myself that this was the only way to stop her, the only way to close a chapter she had written without our consent. By the time I drove into downtown Salem and parked near the cafe, my hands trembled just enough to remind me that I was still human, still hurting, still finding my way through the aftermath of her deception. The team briefed me one last time, their voices steady while mine stayed hidden behind nods. I walked into the cafe, scanning the room until I saw her. Charlotte Benson. She looked smaller somehow, but her eyes still carried that calculating sparkle. When she spotted me, she shifted instantly into a softer persona, one I had seen many times, fragile, apologetic, desperate for understanding. It was the kind of performance that once would have pulled me in without question, but not today. I played along, offering just enough warmth to keep her seated across from me. Inside, though, I felt every bruise she had left on my trust. I watched her study my face, trying to measure what she could still take from me. For a moment, I almost believed she saw me as the same woman she had manipulated before. Then I told her I knew, not with raised voices or anger, but with a calmness that surprised even me. The effect was immediate. Her expression cracked, and I saw the truth behind every mask she had worn. Officers closed in before she could flee, as they took her into custody. Charlotte looked back at me with something between resentment and disbelief, as if she never expected her story to end this way. I stepped outside, letting the cool air wash over me, relief, sadness, and a hollow kind of victory settled together in my chest. And that was the moment I realized the real work, healing, was only beginning. Moving into my new place felt like taking a full breath after holding it for far too long. I chose every inch of it myself. The quiet street, the sunlight that warms the living room in the late morning, even the soft colors on the walls. It wasn't extravagant, but it was mine, built from my own decisions instead of someone else's influence. For the first time in a long while, I felt grounded in my own life again. Michael began finding his footing too. I watched him slowly come back to himself, shedding the layers of doubt and confusion that Charlotte had wrapped around him. He started reaching out to friends again, laughing more, reclaiming pieces of the man he had been before she entered our world. Seeing that change in him became its own kind of healing for me. When investigators recovered about 60% of the money she had taken, I felt both grateful and strangely humbled. I had expected none of it to return. After settling my finances, I chose to donate a portion to organizations that support victims of fraud. It felt important to send something good back into the world, to break the pattern she had spent years creating. As the weeks passed, the sharp edges of the experience softened, leaving behind a quiet clarity. I learned that trust is precious, but so is resilience. And even in the wake of betrayal, there is room to rebuild something stronger. All of that brings me to the reflection I want to share as I close this chapter. Looking back, I can see how every painful moment pushed me toward a deeper understanding of myself. I learned that trust should be offered with care, and that intuition is rarely wrong when something feels off. Through it all, the bond between Michael and me became stronger than it had been in years. We found our way back to each other, not through fear, but through honesty and the determination to heal. What happened to us was devastating, but it reminded me that resilience grows in the spaces where we choose to stand back up. If you've ever ignored your instincts or doubted your own strength, I hope my story encourages you to listen a little closer and protect your peace. Thank you for spending this time with me. It truly means more than you know. And if you've faced something similar, or learned a hard lesson of your own, share it in the comments. I read every one.